and maybe going from the macro to the more micro. So we talked about supranational in general in the first introductory panel, then we moved to regional, and now I'm not saying we're scaling down geographically, but we're scaling down, or let's say, put it this way, we're getting more granular, and we're going to talk about international anti-corruption investigation. And I have to say to the organizer that you made my life difficult, because I thought it was an intriguing title. Because for me, anti-corruption investigation, and even hearing Daniel, at the end of the day, today mostly still mostly national, when we talk really anti-corruption investigation, but or carried out by some bodies like the MDBs, but it's really a peculiarity. At the same time, I see what you're trying to get at, and it is a fact that investigations on corruption have become more and more international, because the economy has become more and more international. And becoming more and more international, and the previous panel touched upon that, they are also become more and more multi-jurisdictional, with all the challenges that it creates. So just to kick off, and the reflection, I think one of the most interesting part that I found in the new OECD recommendation that Patrick mentioned earlier this afternoon is on the multi-jurisdictional cases. And let me read, because I think those are words, but words have consequences. So member countries should encourage direct coordination in concurrent or parallel investigation and prosecution where appropriate, including through such means as the sharing of information and evidence. Direct coordination. And then there is another paragraph which says, consider coordination as early in the process as is feasible and where appropriate, and in such a way that respect the independence of the individual jurisdiction and recognize the benefit of cooperation in achieving effective law enforcement. When you think about it, this is language that would have been unthinkable 20 or 25 years ago, when the C word started to be used in the international community. And when you go a bit further to the international aspect, so not so much the supranational, but the international, we also know that not only investigation, but also resolution are becoming more and more international. They are coordinated. The OECD recommendation also says interesting words on what we call the non-piling on policy, i.e., the fact that you need to take into account what's going on in the other countries. And the international aspect, you even have it in internal control and compliance. In the latest guidance issued by the Department of Justice on internal control and compliance of last year, very few people noted an additional footnote, which I think is super interesting, which basically says, if your internal control and compliance system is different from what we are recommending because of national law requirements, you need to explain and justify it. Which on the one hand, clearly you need to explain and justify it, but on the other hand, it's a recognition that the company can also be bound by other national system. So I would say that as someone who is old enough to remember the convention before the convention existed, and to have been associated to the 1997 signatory signing ceremony in the OECD. By the way, we're going to celebrate they are going to celebrate the 25 years of existence of the convention. And when we look at it from a dynamic point of view, I'm really struck by the increasing maturity of the discussion on international investigation and cooperation. And I'm also now that I work in the private sector and working a lot with companies, I'm struck also by how much this is in the day-to-day mind of international companies. And I'm very, very fortunate to have an incredible panel, which is completely complementary, because we will have Rositsa Zaharieva from the United Nations Secretariat, who is going to talk about this new initiative, GLOBE. I think the acronym itself speaks for itself. We have online, I hope. Do we have online Victoria and Gianpiero?
Yes, you do.
Good. I don't see you, but it's normal, apparently.
Okay, good. I see you.
I see a tiny part of you.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Okay, that's better. Hello, Victoria. So Victoria represents, I would say, a traditional domestic law enforcement authorities, but which has a lot of international connections, and she will certainly talk about it. We have also Gianpiero Antonazzo, I also hope, coming from, yes, I would say, again, a traditional NDB, if I could use this expression. And then we have Albert Lihalakha, who comes from the Green Climate Fund, which is Lihalakha, sorry, which is a new institution with maybe a new approach. So we'll have 4 complementary approaches, and we're going to and Radha Ivory, which is also with us, I hope.
Here.
Radha?
Yes, I'm here.
Good. Who is going to bring the touch of the outsider, i.e. the academic, looking at all this and giving her wisdom with Tina Sorida, that has now moved to other functions, by the way, but is very well known. So we have 2 presentations of 2 papers that were submitted for the symposium. So I will first give the floor to Radha and then Albert. Then I will give the floor to the 3 other speakers, and I completely forgot on which order I said that they were given the floor. Rositsa, Gianpiero, and Victoria. And then we will enter into what I hope to be a real dialogue between ourselves, but with all of you and also with people online. I would like to conclude those few words of introduction by saying that international conditions seem to be more conducive now than any time in the past to address corruption as an issue of global concern. Those words are not my words. Those words are from an article written by Ibrahim Shiata in 1997. And when I saw that, I said this to Alexander, when I saw that this room was dedicated to Mr. Shiata, I thought it was my duty to recall him, as he has been one of the most well-known general counsel of any international organization, and he has really given an imprinting to the bank. But what is striking is that those words could be used again word by word in 2022, which I don't know if it is a good sign or not a good sign. I leave it to you to reflect about that. With that, and I will give the floor now to Radha, who has submitted a paper on the basically the role of foreign bribery settlements, on corporate settlements in foreign bribery cases and what they bring or may not bring to the international anti-corruption investigation. Radha, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I trust you can all hear me. It's a pleasure to be joining you this afternoon or this morning in my time in Australia. The paper I'm presenting today, as Nicola said, is the product of joint work with Professor Tina Sorida, which was published in the International and Comparative Law Quarterly in 2020. It is work that now is being built on in another project on the reform of international anti-corruption law, which I hope will be out in the next year, in the course of next year, as well as our personal involvement in the reform process that has led to recommendations on settlement in the OECD recommendations. So the purpose of these remarks is basically to bring a, let's call it, critical light to bear on the international approach to corporate settlements. So in these few minutes, I will be describing the international position on settlements, both before and after the 2021 OECD recommendations. These are an important development. We shouldn't underestimate the effort that it took to bring them to bear and the impact that they're likely to have both within and beyond the OECD anti-corruption system. And it's important to understand where they come from and whether, and if so, to what extent they overcome some of the difficulties with the previous approach to settlement, which was taken through OECD reports and UN review mechanism reports. So the starting point in the story is how corporate settlements were, or more properly, were not regulated in international law prior to the OECD recommendations being changed last year. We reviewed the UN and the OECD conventions and the associated soft law instruments and determined, as many of you no doubt already know, that there are no provisions dedicated to settlements in those international agreements. Of course, there are provisions that deal with the background conditions to deal making. So terms on the liability of legal persons, the form and standard for national sanctions against legal persons in foreign bribery proceedings. And when we're talking specifically about the OECD convention, an article that attempts to prevent the misuse of prosecutorial discretion in ways that are particularly relevant to proceedings against legal persons. We also know that plea deals, at least, were mentioned as part of the OECD negotiations, but nonetheless, nothing was concluded in the agreement as it took form. That has created a gap in the coverage of the treaty. So again, as many of you no doubt are aware, the vast majority of proceedings involving legal persons and allegations about foreign bribery are resolved out of court. So what we have is an international agreement that is supposed to standardise how countries deal with this particular problem of corruption, and yet a gap in the regulation of a major way in which those problems are resolved. Into that gap, we discovered that the international monitoring bodies, the UNCAC review mechanism and the OECD working group on bribery, were attempting to impose some sorts of constraints. So if you read those documents, and we reviewed some 180 of them, you will find that there is a qualified implicit endorsement of corporate settlement laws and practices at the domestic level. So again, focusing on the OECD, we find the working group acknowledging and at some points praising settlement laws and practices at the domestic level, but nonetheless issuing words of caution around potential non-compliance with those core treaty terms I already mentioned, and some, let's call them background principles, like transparency and accountability, predictability and consistency. So in the absence of express rules, there is an implicit report-based approach to regulation of corporate settlement laws and practices. This then begs the question, this finding, of how this approach should be assessed. And we developed and then applied procedural and substantive criteria to assessing how this approach was developed and how well it's shaping national law and practice. So on the procedural score, we were concerned, obviously, with the fact that the approach to this problem is diffused. It is found across numerous reports rather than in one single location that can be accessed by the people who would need to know what they are. There are also, of course, challenges around participation of non-government actors, given that the OECD and talking more broadly, the UN review processes are intergovernmental. The substantive criteria we used were concerned with the effect of settlements on access to justice, the prevention of foreign bribery, and cost effectiveness. Here we found that the report-based approach to regulation does address some of these matters without being comprehensive within or across them. So, in short, there are gaps through which national law and national settlement law and practice may well fall through. So overall, we arrived at an irony. The OECD, and if we're talking more broadly, the UN, call for transparent and effective and predictable domestic settlement laws and practices, but they do not themselves provide rules that meet that standard. So this is the background against which the OECD recommendations on settlement were introduced late last year. The recommendations, again, as you are no doubt aware, explicitly address the problem or the issue of non-trial resolution. And again, they seem to take this approach of endorsement with qualifications. So the question for our ongoing work is whether this law, this soft law at any rate, will change the regulation of this type of national law and practice for the better. This is preliminary work, but the findings suggest both, for want of a better word, some pros and cons. On the one hand, of course, this is an explicit set of regulations that is indeed a development on the past law. It refers to due process, which was not a principle that figured expressly in the OECD reports. And it deals with or articulates some of the key substantive points that were missing in, or at least problematic in the OECD reports. These concern things like the articulation or transparency of national legal frameworks, independent review of settlements, the relationship to individual prosecutions, and so on. Nonetheless, they are likely to encounter problems with implementation. We know that foreign bribery law overall has challenges of being enforced. Few countries meet that standard of being so-called active enforcers. Will the recommendations meet the same challenges that the enforcement apparatus overall has encountered? Will prosecutors be willing to give up the discretions that they regard as an efficient means to resolve foreign bribery cases? Will others in government be willing to introduce laws that settlement laws and practices that are proofed against misuse, given that it's strategically important economic actors who may well be in the crosshairs? Overall, is the necessary flexibility that's provided by an international standard of this sort going to be sufficient to guide states and render this type of practice acceptable from a bribery prevention point of view? Then there are challenges of legitimacy. Again, we have an intergovernmental body deciding matters that affect people at various levels of the state, be they in the public or the private sector, non-governmental actors, so on and so forth. There are challenges around expertise, whose views count as being sufficiently authoritative to influence how the approach to settlement was developed within the OECD working group. And the fact that in some ways the recommendations, accept rather than challenge this particular practice, which in times of increasing concern about global income inequality and corporate power are problematic in the literature. So I'll conclude my remarks there and welcome more discussion of these issues in the Q&A. Back over to you, Nicola.
Thank you, Radha. I would say that this is the perfect subject, I think, to introduce this panel, in a sense that the idea of non-trial resolution or settlements, whatever however you want to call them, was clearly introduced in order to deal with the international aspect of the challenge. But naturally, in the laws that exist, and possibly in the future laws that will be adopted, maybe based on the OECD recommendation, these are not limited only to transnational bribery case. In the French law, for example, the CGIP, which has been introduced, deals with corruption cases. So you can apply it also to a domestic case. And I think it's interesting because it shows how also, going back to the previous panel, how international initiative, even if they may be narrowed in scope in the beginning, have an impact which maybe go beyond the original scope and may change the legal system of the countries. I will leave it there, but I have a question which I will not ask you to answer now, but keep it in mind because it's a question from someone online. You said rightly that there is a presumption in the recommendation or an hint that countries should introduce those non-trial resolution. What are the risks of introducing such a system in countries with a relatively weak system or rule of law or a relatively weak judiciary? So keep the question. And I now move to the second presentation from Albert Lihalakha, who is going to present the integrity mechanism which has been put in place by the Green Climate Fund, and I'm sure you will find it very interesting because it's a new fund and it's maybe a new approach.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you, colleagues, for inviting us here to speak. It's a pleasure to be here in Vienna and get to meet some of you and exchange some ideas. The Green Climate Fund is indeed a relatively new organization, and we have worked quite a bit to get our processes and policies in place. So if you bear with me, what I'd like to do is provide a little bit of context and background to what the GCF is and how we at the Independent Integrity Unit of the GCF operate to help safeguard against corruption, fraud, and other prohibited practices. So as Nicola had indicated, my name is Albert Lihalakha. I'm the Deputy Head of the Independent Integrity Unit of the Green Climate Fund. Now, for those of us unfamiliar with the GCF, I'd like to take a few moments to provide a little bit of context. The current global temperature is generally thought to be at about 1.1 degrees Celsius, hotter than it was in pre-industrial levels. If the trend continues, we will be approaching at 1.5 degrees in the next couple of decades, and 2 degrees Celsius going towards the end of the century. So what does this mean? If you turn on the news in any given day, you will find reports of significant climate change events, severe heat waves, widespread and more persistent wildfires, severe and prolonged droughts, extreme rainfalls, and fatal floods, just to name a few. Just 2 weeks ago, South Africa suffered one of the biggest natural disasters in the country's history, which estimated 448 people died and 40,000 people displaced due to flooding and mudslides. These disasters are happening now. Further warming would only lead to greater extreme temperatures and events, adverse impact on biodiversity, food production, and exacerbate an already damaged ecosystem. For those interested in the world's oceans, with a warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the anticipated loss is going to be 70 to 90% of the world's coral reefs. And at 2 degrees Celsius, we can expect a 99% of our reefs, loss of our reefs. These are indeed cataclysmic events and underscore the urgency of immediate climate action. It is against this backdrop that the Green Climate Fund is established in 2010 within the framework of the UNFCCC. The governing instrument that operationalized the fund was approved in December 2011, and the fund opened its doors in 2013 at its headquarters in Songdo, South Korea. Although the initial resource mobilization happened in 2014, it wasn't until the adoption of the Paris Agreement in December 2015 that the Green Climate Fund began serving as its financial mechanism of the convention. The GCF's mandate is to support developing nations realize their national ambitions towards the low carbon emissions and the development of climate resilient pathways. Since the establishment of the GCF, the fund has grown to become the largest climate fund and aims to mobilize $100 billion a year to address the pressing mitigation and adaptation needs of the developing countries. With this ambition and the increased number of projects, complex financing models, country ownership, the opportunities for fraud and corruption are multiplied. This is where the independent units come into play. The Independent Integrity Unit, which is the one of the accountability mechanisms of the Green Climate Fund, was established in 2016, and the IU was created to investigate allegations of fraud and corruption, along with other prohibited practices, namely collusion, coercion, obstruction, abuse, retaliation, terrorism financing. These are practices prohibited at the Green Climate Fund and will initiate an investigative response. These practices are akin to the sanctionable practices in the MDB world. The IAU has two primary mandates. One, it's preventative, and the second is investigations. And we capitalize on this opportunity to work with our GCF Secretariat and establish the requisite policy frameworks. For illustrative purposes, I'd like to highlight some of the important policies as they pertain to managing integrity risks at the fund. The policy of ethics and conflict of interest that sets out the principles and ethical standards for our board members, alternate board members, advisors, the executive director, external members that serve on panels and groups established by the board, active observers, board appointed officials. A few other important policies related to integrities are the policy on the protection of whistleblowers and witnesses, the policy on prohibited practices, and the administrative remedies and exclusions policy. It is these policies that form the legal basis for contractual agreements and responses to integrity violations. They provide the IAU leverage to investigate prohibited practices and the GCF the legal recourse to remediate integrity violations. Particularly germane to this discussion is the ARE policy, which establishes a post-investigation remediation procedure designed to protect the fund while ensuring due process for its respondents. Whenever investigation is carried out by the IAU and the allegation of prohibited practices is substantiated, the IAU will submit a statement of charges to a case review officer and/or a case review panel for the determination and decision to be made as provided by the ARE policy. The structure of the ARE process is as follows. The main feature of the proposed structure is the administrative process is a two-tiered system. The first tier is a case review officer with the responsibility to determine whether the preponderance of evidence submitted by the IAU leads to a finding that the respondents have engaged in prohibited practices. The second tier is a case review panel composed of one GCF staff member and 2 outside experts, which will conduct further review of the case if the respondent is not satisfied by the initial determination of the case review officer. The case review officer and the case review panel will decide on the appropriate administrative remedy and exclusion to be applied in each case based on the criteria elaborated in our Administrative Remedies and Exclusions Guidelines. The introduction of the 2-tier process seeks to apply a system of rigorous assessment, review of relevant evidence efforts, affords sufficient process to the respondents, and assures that the independent and impartial decision-making by subject matter experts. The IU ensures that all GCS staff, external stakeholders, implementing entities, and intermediaries related to the GCF adhere to the highest standards of integrity and safeguard the lawful and efficient utilization of GCF resources. The unique principle of the ARE policy is that it affords an opportunity for reform. It requires that parties found to have engaged in priority practices to rehabilitate their processes and adhere to GCF standards before they can be reconsidered for GCF funding. The IOU's mission is relatively straightforward. One is to build a robust policy environment that all stakeholders must adhere to. 2 is support the alignment and integration of integrity policies in all legal agreements and across GCF operations. 3, proactively monitor the implementation of GCF projects for the occurrence of integrity risks. 4, collaborate with through peer alliances and strategic partnerships with stakeholders. And 5, in the event of the integrity failure, activate an investigative response and reinforce compliance reform. Another very important safeguard at the Green Climate Fund is the accreditation and the reaccreditation process. For potential partners vying to work with the Green Climate Fund, they will have to go through a stringent accreditation process that obligates them to establish and demonstrate, among other things, accountability mechanisms that mitigate and address integrity risks. Therefore, before an entity becomes eligible to receive GCF funds, they must be well positioned to respond to integrity issues such as corruption. This is indeed a meticulous and onerous endeavor that every accredited entity undergoes every 5-year cycle. The process is known as reaccreditation, which inter alia will include reassessment of their accountability mechanisms, fiduciary standards, and their history of dealing with integrity complaints. The accreditation and reaccreditation process is important because contractual obligations stipulate that the accredited entities will be the first port of call in addressing integrity violations. The findings of their investigations will then be shared with their independent integrity unit for assessment and action. The provisions, however, do not preclude us from conducting our own investigations, but they create great opportunity for a unique system of checks and balances. The Green Climate Fund currently has 133 accredited entities, such as the African Development Bank, IFAD, and the Land Bank of the Philippines. This avails us the added benefit of concomitantly increasing the number of reporting channels for integrity violations in any given project. Speaking of which, the IIU maintains a 24/7 hotline service available for multiple languages, along with an online form that feeds our case management system, where people can report any integrity violations for the IIU's action. Having worked to establish the legal basis and mechanism for that define integrity violations, articulate remedial actions, protect whistleblowers, and provide policy support for all stakeholders, the IIU proactively works to identify those areas vulnerable to integrity violations and to respond with the appropriate intervention. We actively engage with our external partners and stakeholders to reinforce high integrity standards in GCF-funded activities, which include signing MOUs that facilitate activities such as information sharing and case referrals between organizations. To date, the IAU has 27 MOUs and is currently engaging with other organizations to build on that number. Along the theme of international partnerships and cooperation, through its preventative mandate, the IAU proactively works with project staff to garner an understanding of project issues, build capacities, and create awareness. As part of our respective work plans, the IAU and the GCF Secretariat have made proactive integrity reviews a priority initiative. The PRIAs review all GCF projects and identify areas vulnerable to corruption and other prohibited practices. The IAU will then work with both Secretariat and project colleagues to conduct an assessment, determine suitable corrective applications, and work to build the capacities required to implement the mitigation measures. The goal here is not investigative or ascribe punitive measures, but to work with our stakeholders to effect positive change in the projects. The appetite for cooperation is therefore relatively high. PRs are not a novel idea, and in fact, they're actively undertaken by international organizations such as the Asian Development Bank and the European Investment Bank. What is unique about the IAU's approach is the early use of technical and technology innovation in identifying integrity risk, which is an adjunct to a project initiated a little over a year and a half ago to help identify fraud, corruption, and other vulnerabilities. Yes. Sorry. Sure. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up. I only have 2 minutes. Nicola wants me to get off. Okay. Let me see, where am I at? So the use of technologies. So I'll skip over to the innovation in our investigations component. So the IAU uses technology in its investigations process with the application of digital investigative capabilities such as computer and mobile forensics, electronic discovery techniques, and the use of open source intelligence. That the IAU has had remarkable success in identifying and adducing high quality evidence in its investigation. This is exciting because intelligent automation and digital investigation techniques allow the organization to bring great efficiencies in the investigation process. This mechanism helps investigators quickly spot spot trends, anomalies, map relationships between parties and entities, and identify any other pertinent red flags. So in a general sense, what IAU is seeking to do is create an environment less conducive to the occurrence of prohibited practices and more conducive to a culture of integrity in its GCF-funded projects. I believe maybe 2 or 3 days ago, our Transparency International colleagues released a report that articulates some of this information. I think it's something that is available online, and I'd be very happy to provide links to those that may be interested. It provides a comparison of all climate funds and the mechanisms put in place to address corruption issues along with other prohibited practices. With that, Nicola, thank you very much, and I appreciate you letting me go over by a few minutes. Over.
Thank you, Albert. Sorry for being this is my job, no? As you know. But I thought it's very interesting. Actually, I think during the conversation, it would be good if you could elaborate a bit more on the use of data, in particular in an area like the one that you have discussed, because I think this is indeed an in and out of it approach. And I also was interested by the MOUs on case referrals. During the discussion, we are going to talk a bit about that also with our colleague from the World Bank. We now move to 3 introductions of, basically 3 international investigation experiences from 3 different points of view. First, UNODC, Rositsa will say a few words about this new mechanism, recent mechanism, let's put it this way. Then Gianpiero will talk about INT, which is maybe known to some of you, but maybe not all of you. And I asked Gianpiero also to focus on the current challenges. And then Victoria will elaborate on the Serious Fraud Office, which is, for those who are not aware, the law enforcement agency in the UK dealing with transnational bribery cases and with a number of other economic and financial crimes, and focusing in particular on the international, naturally, aspect of her work. Rositsa, so you have the floor. Talk about the globe, which is a challenge.
Well, what is GLOBE? That's the Global Operational Network of Anti-Corruption Law Enforcement Authorities. And during today's discussion, it popped up already several times. Sherwin referred to this as the GLOBE Network, which is the right way when we have to stick to the title of it. Nicola called it a mechanism and an initiative. I have heard people referring to GLOBE as a project. My preference is definitely not to call it a project, but my favorite way to refer to the GLOBE network is as to a community. And why am I saying this? We heard in the previous session very interesting discussions from esteemed colleagues and scholars about challenges that are encountered in the process of fighting corruption. Why do we have microphony, or is it just me?
No.
Okay. I thought it's my ears. Okay, great. And the challenges are various. We can have a discussion, and I'm sure Nicola would love to get into that discussion, but to put it shortly, the UN Convention Against Corruption provides for a lot of ways to facilitate international cooperation. Some of them are very well known to the practitioners, such as the MLA. Others are quite sophisticated, quite rare, speaking globally, such as the joint investigative bodies. And still, if you turn to practitioners that are dealing with anti-corruption investigations and you ask them, what are the major challenges that you're encountering in your work? They would give you a long list of problems. And that list may start with, it is so hard to identify my counterpart, even at national level, because there would be multiple anti-corruption agencies or bodies within my own jurisdiction. And sometimes we do not have the goodwill or the capacity to talk to each other, or it's challenging to find my counterpart in a different jurisdiction. And even if I manage to find that counterpart, I have troubles working together with them. And then we actually fall into the biggest problem of us all when we're talking about cross-border investigations. And this is the problem of the lack of trust. I don't want to get into the direction of how needed political will is, because here we step on the basis that there is a political will. We are operating in an environment of a good political will, and still anti-corruption practitioners are faced with challenges. So trying to answer to these needs of the operational anti-corruption authorities, last year in the beginning of June, the GLOBE network was launched. And I must tell you that for slightly over 10 months, the GLOBE network has already 96 member authorities from 56 countries, which speaks a lot. It means that there is a general global need of a platform such as GLOBE. That platform was established with the idea to provide a way for peers to connect to their peers, to exchange information directly, but also to cooperate in an informal way. The members of the GLOBE network are actually the authorities, the anti-corruption authorities. The everyday, day-to-day running of the operations of the network is done by a permanent secretariat, which is part of UNODC, and thus giving us the great benefit of using the capacities and experience and the technical availabilities of UNODC as a center of one of the centers of expertise in the area of anti-corruption. But the network itself, that is the combination of all these anti-corruption law enforcement authorities coming from all different continents. And it is growing very fast. When the network was conceived, there was this concept on what major pillars it will be based upon. And this is something I want to briefly introduce to you, but also to say that that concept is evolving and developing and enriching month after month, now that we have more members, and every one of these members brings in quite interesting and valuable ideas. So from the initial concept of GLOBE, which was probably just a year ago put into paper, until what we have nowadays, there is already an evolution. But the original concept was that the first component of GLOBE, that would be indeed the network of the practitioners. And we put a great deal of value and importance into that element because a network as such could be a mechanical mixture of people that are brought together because of a formal principle or because of an administrative order. But for law enforcement practitioner, for a police officer, for example, to pick up the phone and call their colleague, no administrative order can make them do that. There must be, knowledge who is the other person, and also you have to be able to share with this other person, with this other colleague, details about your case, about your operation. And law enforcement world is extremely protective about their cases, as we all know. They don't like to share. These are their own cases. So this is quite a complex situation which needs a lot of attention to build a community out of this whole thing. But what is good and what works in the favor of GLOBE is that also these specialized authorities want to build that community because they see the need of having it and to reaching out and to benefiting from the support. And just to make a side note here, we are already supporting the casework of several of our members. And what strikes me is that it is not authorities from the same region that would reach out to us asking to help to put them together. Regionally, authorities pretty much know well each other. These are authorities from completely distant continents and countries that you would never think would have anything in common. And this is extremely fascinating to see how a global network such as GLOBE can facilitate contacts of countries that you would never imagine being put together in the same sentence. But having a community, having a common vision is crucial for an advancement of this idea. However, that's also a world of practicalities. And one of the practicalities and the challenges is how these people will communicate to each other. Currently, because the GLOBE network is still quite young, most of the communications are facilitated through the Secretariat. What we want to achieve is to create a means, also in terms of IT structure, so that our members can be able to communicate to each other in a secure end-to-end encrypted manner. So we are now dedicating a lot of efforts into developing that communication system, that communication platform, through which the GLOBE network members can actually directly reach each other without the facilitation of the Secretariat. However, the Secretariat will stay there to help them and to navigate them if they don't know whom to address. But once they know each other, they can do that in a safe and secure environment. And last but not least, I would say, and some references we had already to that, that a big issue in the world of anti-corruption work is the issue of capacity. And of course, many of us come from jurisdictions that take great pride in having traditions in fighting corruptions. Some of us recognize that there is a lot to be done in the area of development of our capacities. But it is true that the countries around the globe have different level of knowledge and understanding and, generally speaking, capacity how to tackle corruption. So the Globe Network also aims, as the third component of its work, to develop the capacities of these anti-corruption authorities, mostly by stimulating peer-to-peer exchange, because this would be the way that one practitioner can learn from the practical experiences of another one. Of course, in addition to the peer-to-peer exchange, again, we have the benefit of the technical capacities of UNODC, and many technical programs that are successfully offered to practitioners can be accommodated to the needs of the Globe Network members. Already today, we had the launch of the first knowledge session of the Globe Network. We had to step outside for the opening part of it. And we had over 200 registered participants speaking what a great level of interest there is to increasing the knowledge in this particular area. I think I managed to follow actually the classical investigative protocol and answer the questions who, why, what, when, and how. But of course, I'm sure that Nicola has a lot of questions to follow up to my brief presentation. Thank you.
I certainly do, but I will not monopolize the word. One question is indeed, I like very much your presentation of Globe as a community. And the question here is how to ensure the sustainability of the community, given that people go and move, and institution even can change. But again, leave it for maybe further discussion. Talking about an institution which has a bit of history now, because I don't know exactly when it was established, but it's now a certain number of years. We're very happy to have Gianpiero Antonazzo from the World Bank INT, in the integrity unit of the World Bank, and speaking from his C-suite with his wonderful background, which we all know is fake, but Gianpiero, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Yes, it is a fake background, and it's part of our job to go after, fake things. Anyway, thank you very much for organizing this event. I would like to thank, first of all, the organizers for this very nice event, very, very informative and very well organized. Fortunately, I would have liked to be present there, but I could not, so I apologize for that. And I would like also to thank you very much, Nicola, for including me in this panel, and thank you for organizing and coordinating this. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this panel with such esteemed colleagues. I would like to introduce a little bit, the work that we do at the World Bank. Although, as you said, for some may already be familiar with it. Just let me say that. I come from a criminal investigation background. Working for the bank, I used to work for the financial police in Italy. So when I moved to the World Bank and started this work in the world of the international administrative investigations, I was challenging myself because coming from a criminal type of background, I was lacking some of the powers that we used on a national level, and I was wondering to myself whether I would be able to work in the same effective way. Well, after almost 13 years at the World Bank, I have to say that this is a great way to implement, to enhance probably the investigative work at the international level. To answer your question about how many years the Integrity Vice Presidency has right now, I think we just passed the 20 years mark. So we have acquired quite a good amount of experience internationally and conducting this type of investigations worldwide. So it's a great way to implement the work of a national investigations, because we at the World Bank, we are very flexible in how we can conduct our investigation work. As you know, the World Bank created this the Integrity Vice Presidency because it cares about how its funds are used. So the main purpose of our work is to make sure that our funds are used for their intended purposes. And having that in mind, we basically can go around the world and check our projects, check how our money is used, and verify whether there are what we call sanctionable practices. The bank, as you may know, has defined 5 different sanctionable practices: fraud, collusion, corruption, coercion, and obstruction. I'm not going to go over the definitions of that. I think earlier in the day, we have already discussed about that. But those are the, in the criminal world would be the crimes that we go after, and what we can investigate as sanctionable offenses in our projects. Of course, we have a number of inputs to our work. We can receive complaints, from pretty much everybody, both internally from the World Bank, but also externally from those that are involved in the projects. Also, people that are not involved in the projects can report fraud, allegations of fraud and corruption to the World Bank. And we assess them. We have a process to go through what we call an assessment of these allegations, to make sure that they fall under our mandate, first of all, and to select those that deserve a full investigation. Of course, we don't have resources to go after all the allegations that we receive. We see a very high number of allegations, so it's very difficult for us to fully investigate all of them. So we have to triage them and to investigate those that we think they deserve to be fully investigated. The way we investigate them, like I said before, it's very flexible compared to traditional or a national investigation conducted also internationally, because we don't have to ask for cooperation from other institutions from other countries. Being at the World Bank, then I think being at the World Bank is just that if we have to investigate an allegation in any country in the world, we just have to go to the airport, jump on the plane and go to that country and conduct our own work. That is because our investigations are based on basically on the contracts that individuals and companies sign when those contracts are funded by the World Bank and that fall under the World Bank projects. We have procurement guidelines that guide the tender process where our funds are being used in our projects throughout the world. So the individuals and companies who will bid and submit their bid and in this tender, they know what are the rules of the game. They know that there are fraud and corruption clauses in their contracts, and they have to respect those. Also in their contracts is contained the audit clause, which is what we use when we carry out our work to inspect their books and records. And we can enforce the clause, and we can ask companies and individuals provide us with records of those transactions that are referred to the World Bank contract. And this is not the investigation in itself. The investigation is a much larger process than the audit. But the audit is definitely one of the most powerful tools that we can use in our investigation. Because it allows us simply to go in any country and ask for any company for these records, and like I said, without going through any kind of international agreement or MLA or anything like that. So it's a very powerful tool, and along with interviews and analysis of documentation that we gather from, for example, the project implementation units that are the entities on the ground that are actually conducting and implementing our project. We have the ability to collect all the information and at the end of the day to verify whether or not the allegations that we initially received are substantiated or not. If we do so, if we are able to do that, as you may know, we can initiate the sanction process within the World Bank. So in a way, we are very similar to what a prosecution office would do on a criminal level, on a national level. However, we are not the office that issued the decision, as you may know. Here today, we have other colleagues that are actually competent for that. But INT initiates that process. And that process can lead, as you know, eventually to a sanction to be applied to the responsible party, whether there is a company or individual. During the years, along with this, I would say, the core business of the investigation that INT started with. At the beginning, we only had this. But, throughout the years, we understood that it's not enough only to do investigation, but in order to build capacity in our member countries, we also needed to implement what we call, and it is called preventive service unit. It's a unit that learns from our investigation and tries to duplicate those lessons in new projects in order to avoid that, the same mistakes, the same sexual practice may occur. So it's a very beneficial process where, some issues, some problems can be avoided while basically giving advices to our member countries on how to implement their ring fence, how to ring fence their project, and hopefully how to avoid the same mistakes that happened in the past would replicate and will happen again. And also very recently we have let's say, I would call it a third component of INT, which is the Integrity Compliance Office. Basically, after the investigation, after the sanction has been imposed on a respondent or a responsible party, that party has to go now through what we call a compliance program. So most of our sanctions, they do include an obligation for company to go through this compliance process. And if they don't have one, or if they have a weak one, they have to implement a very robust compliance program. And this program is assessed by this unit within the INT, what we call ICO, Integrity and Compliance Office. Only if this unit is satisfied with the program that the company has implemented, and so there are checks and balances along the implementation of this program by the companies. So the company is supposed to interact with the ICO and show how the program is being implemented. Some sanctions do require that the satisfaction of this program is a condition for the release, from the department. If these conditions are not met, the company is not released by from the department list. And so this is a big deal for companies who have to implement this program and have to show that the program is actually effective and works. Another outcome of our investigation.
Gianpiero, can I ask you to wrap up, please?
Yes, I am wrapping up with basically one of the outcome that is also from our investigation, which is the referral. So since the things that we investigated at the World Bank are our investigations are administrative, of course, but the fact that we investigate are the same facts that on a national level may constitute a crime, and so may be relevant for the jurisdictions to investigate by themselves. We send a referral to the member countries of the World Bank in order to let them conduct their own independent activities, whether it's a criminal investigation or it's an administrative investigation. We do have this duty to refer this to member countries because they are the shareholders basically of the World Bank, and so it's their interest to be aware of what, if a fact that can be a crime under the national jurisdiction has happened or not in their jurisdiction. So I'll stop it there, and I'll wait for further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gianpiero. I think we have seen already that when we're talking about investigation, we're talking, in fact, more than investigation, because we are also talking about international cooperation. We're talking about prevention. We're talking about compliance, and it's a sort of continuum. I will, and you are not taken by surprise because we discussed this during the preparatory call. So I will plant already a question about the referral, because I think it's an important point. Also, Albert was referring to the referral, and Rositsa was also talking about, law enforcement authority talking about ongoing cases. And I will have a very specific question for you that I would like to you to answer in the second after we have heard from Victoria, which goes to the case that you had in Canada, the case named Wallace, in which you referred a case to the Canadian authorities, and then this was, let's say, litigated in court, and there were the lawyers of the company were trying to call World Bank officials as witness in front of the Canadian court. The case has been dismissed, and the immunities of the bank have been recognized. But I think it would be important to give to the group what is the today policy and practice of the bank in terms of referral. Victoria, we started with, let's say, non-traditional international investigation mechanism or communities or whatever you want to call them. Let's go to a more traditional one, which is the domestic law authority, but with already in the DNA a vocation to be international, because you will be dealing almost by nature with transnational aspects of investigation. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you for having me, albeit virtually, and without my C-suite background. I'm afraid I didn't get that far with the IT. My usual audience for speaking engagements is the defense bar, so this makes for a really nice change of atmosphere, I have to say. At the Serious Fraud Office, I'm what we call a case controller. That is effectively a case lead or a senior prosecutor. I'm a barrister by training originally. And the Serious Fraud Office, which is led by our director, Lisa Osowski, is now in its 4th decade of combating financial crime. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of the SFO, some of the challenges that we face, and the tools that we have available to us for tackling international bribery and corruption. We're a specialist independent government department. We form part of the overall criminal justice system within England, with jurisdiction of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And we operate with kind of a unique structure with a view to tackling the difficulties inherent in international bribery, corruption, and large and complex fraud cases, with a view to bringing in all at once under the one roof the necessary skills and expertise required. So we have, from the beginning, case teams comprising investigators, prosecutors, sector specialists, forensic accountants, computer experts, and trial counsel. And that's all with a view that we can channel our investigations from the beginning to secure effective outcomes. Our mandate dictates that the SFO may investigate any suspected offence within its jurisdiction which appears on reasonable grounds to involve serious or complex fraud, bribery, and corruption, which means that we end up taking on a rather relatively small number of very large economic crime cases. And these cases, some of them I'm sure you've heard of: Amec Foster Wheeler, Petrofac, Rolls-Royce, Airbus, Unoil, Tesco, Libor, Euribor, to name a few. Prevention, detection, investigation, and sanction of international bribery and corruption present really unique challenges, and that's not least because of the multi-jurisdictional nature of this type of misconduct. And that's where the work of the SFO does come in. But a thread that will run through everything I'm about to say is that we really cannot take on this fight alone. And our collaboration and cooperation with partner law enforcement agencies and multilateral forums, the OECD, it's really vital in combating cross-border corruption for us. So prevention, to my mind, really realistically, it amounts to deterrence. And this can be accomplished by effective legislation, robust penalties, international coordination, and fit-for-purpose compliance programs. The legislation that we work with in the United Kingdom is called the Bribery Act 2010. It came into effect in July 2011, and it really does cross jurisdictional boundaries as much as we are able to more accurately reflect the version of modern international corruption that we are hoping to combat. It changed the way that bribery could be prosecuted quite dramatically in our jurisdiction. And one of those ways was that it created a new strict liability offence of failing to prevent bribery. So that offence only applies to corporate entities, not to individuals. And it does allow a defence to be raised, although the burden is on the company to prove it, that it had in place adequate procedures that were designed to prevent bribery. The Act also extended the jurisdictional basis for bribery offences. So now substantive bribery offences apply not just to those that are committed within the UK, but those that are committed overseas if there is a close UK connection. The jurisdictional reach of the failure to prevent offence is even wider, casts a larger net because it doesn't require that close connection. It just requires that the UK the entity is incorporated in the UK or carries on part of its business here, which is a pretty loose test, actually. In terms of sanction, robust punishment will always be a deterrent, though I think the introduction of deferred prosecution agreements in our country has, to the prosecutor's arsenal of resolutions, has offered something of a carrot as well. But whether it's by conviction or by DPA, a corporate can expect to pay really hefty penalties with multipliers of the profits gained from bribery that start at 300%. And individuals will face lengthy prison sentences upon conviction. And both companies and individuals will be subject to confiscation of any ill-gotten gains. And we have some fairly sophisticated ways of assessing that. A connected global approach to investigating bribery and corruption will mean that it is more likely that it is discovered, it is more likely that it is investigated properly, and it is more likely that there will be a joined up global resolution. If the sun shines across the globe, there is a lot less space to hide in the shadows. And the UK is a signatory to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention and a member of the working group. We're really closely aligned and frequently in contact with our international law enforcement partners. In fact, I've just come from a 2-day symposium with the US Department of Justice, where we were sat in a room talking about the best ways that we can work together to address this. So it's not just lip service I'm paying to that, it is very real. And then I think on the corporate side, prevention really will be greatly assisted by the implementation of compliance programs that have teeth. And it really matters for 2 reasons, because first, it's the gateway of prevention in the first instance, of course, but it's the foundation of the defense of the failure to prevent offense that I just spoke about. So adequate policies and procedures. Any compliance program really needs to have teeth and not simply be a paper exercise. But it's a really key feature for us when we're looking at corporates at every stage of investigation through to decision whether or not to prosecute. And it gets assessed really early on. We look at the past, we look at the present, and we look at the potential future state of any program. In terms of actual change across the world, it's an attitude as well. So it's really vital work of NGOs and supranational bodies, the UN, multilateral forums, the World Bank, investigative journalists. All of this will impact, the legislation that individual countries decide to implement or not, the extraterritorial reach of those. And I think it will help to move the compass on what is acceptable business practice and governance overall. So moving to detection, we are always looking at ways in which we can bolster our efforts in detecting criminal conduct and bringing cases that meet our specialist criteria. But detection of foreign bribery, it does come from a wide variety of sources, but it won't be surprising that the detection of the international and cross-border variety, it really involves working closely with our international partners. And the importance of those relationships, it goes to intelligence sharing, discussions on jurisdictional primacy, early engagement with mutual legal assistance, and so on and so forth. So the means by which international corruption and its proceeds are facilitated, sometimes they are blatant, but more often they're incredibly sophisticated. It's complex corporate structures, opaque financial transactions, offshore centers, and all of these factors together make tackling cross-border corruption much more exacting. So it seems very clear to me and to those in my organization that there needs to be a concerted effort across public and private sectors, domestically and internationally. It has to be dynamic, innovative, and proactive at every single stage. In terms of investigation, the tools that we have at our disposal, because they're complex, resource intensive, they are long. We are working really hard to try and be more precise in the ways that we can, but there is now with iPhones and laptops and the way that we do business generally, a huge amount of data. We're talking terabytes. In Rolls-Royce, there were 30 million documents to be sifted, and that is an extreme example, but it is a challenge that we face, certainly. We have quite draconian powers of compulsion in the UK that are specific to the SFO. It's not law enforcement generally, but we have the power to compel a company or an individual to furnish us with documents or information or to answer questions, and a failure to do so can attract criminal liability. That is a really key way in which we do our investigations. And then, of course, the formal international evidence gathering route, letter of request and mutual legal assistance from foreign authorities. And those well-developed relationships that come from working together over time, or these forums that bring us together. I'm really keen to hear more about the Globe Network, for example. That really assists with the speed and the accuracy with which these requests are responded, to make sure that we know exactly what another country is looking for in the way we draft our documents, and the trust that is built on the back of those relationships. So it isn't just the formal process. There's work to be done around that, I think. And the less formal route, but no less common, is police-to-police intelligence sharing. It's not evidence, but it can lead to evidence gathering. And again, this is about relationship building, because the instinct to share, someone mentioned that we can quite jealously guard our investigations, and I think that we need to do more to move away from that. But the relationships that are there for sharing intelligence are really important.
Victoria, can I ask you to wrap up?
I will wrap up quickly. I was just going to say that the options at our disposal for sanction, of course, are criminal charge or negotiated plea arrangements, but we also have deferred prosecution agreements, which are effectively somewhere between civil and criminal, and have, since their introduction, been a really useful tool. They're all supervised and sanctioned by a judge, so it's not some rogue prosecutor being able to agree with the company whatever they want. But we've been really nimble. We've had agreed 12 now, and been increasingly nimble in how we've been able to deploy them. There have been record-breaking resolutions with the French PNF, the US DOJ with Airbus, as well as with Amick Foster Wheeler with the US and the Brazilian authorities, including compensation that was returned to victims in Nigeria. So again, working together with global resolutions. And I think that I would just say that the strategic benefit really of working together with multi-jurisdictional cases is that it gives a really clear message to corporates that there isn't daylight that can be exploited between us. And I think that that's a really important point in terms of global tackling of bribery and corruption. If we're joined up, there really isn't, they're held accountable at every stage through investigation to settlement. And I think that is something that we're seeing is really important and beneficial, and means that as much as can be prosecuted or tackled with a resolution is going to be. Thanks. Sorry for running over.
No, and sorry, Victoria, for having intervened, but it's 6:15. I would like to wrap up by 6:30.
Sure.
I had a lot of questions which I will keep in my pocket because I think it's important that the floor and the people online be given an opportunity. So let me first take a couple of online questions before opening to the floor here. The first one is the one on risk of a non-trial resolution or whatever settlement or DPA, whatever you want to call it again, in a country which has not, let's say, a robust rule of law. And I will direct this question specifically to Radha, but if others want to respond, they're more than welcome. The second question is a question which I find interesting, which is basically, all the international investigation bodies that have been speaking today. The question is, why don't you get at the demand side of the corruption case? And just to end on what you were saying, Victoria, about the corporate, and I'm not inventing the question. It's a true. I'm not defending my own new business line of business, but the question is indeed, why don't you prosecute people in the countries? And I think maybe if I can make it a bit more concrete, also, Gianpiero, there was an interesting case in the bank a few years ago with respect to a specific project in which the bank took a very strong position vis-a-vis a one-member country, saying, you should prosecute your own officials. If not, you will lose the benefit of the loan. I know it sparked a lot of controversy, and I don't think this has ever been replicated. But I think the question goes a bit to this particular challenge of looking at one side of the coin, which is the briber, and less the other side of the coin, which is the bribee, typically outside of the territory, which is naturally one of the answers that you're going to give me. But rather on the risk, and then on the second question about the let's say, the demand side.
Very much, Nicola, and thanks very much to the audience member who posed this excellent question. It really does go to the heart of, I think, the international problem of corporate settlement. So I think, though, we need to take a step back from the question, which is about the risk of introducing non-trial resolutions or settlements in countries with, for want of a better word, weaker rule of law systems, and look at the problems of corporate settlements more broadly. So the problems that come up can be divided under the headings of their effects on access to justice, prevention, and cost. So basically, do we allow prosecutors too much room to put pressure on defendants, corporate defendants, who may then put pressure on individual defendants? Or do we allow prosecutors to put too much direct pressure on individuals if they are the ones who are doing the deals? Do we allow prosecutors too much discretion to, as it were, collude with corporations to get what would be a suboptimal outcome when compared to a trial-based outcome? That's something that Victoria alluded to as not happening within the UK space. There we have problems that the non-trial resolution doesn't serve as perhaps as good a signalling function, serving that kind of general deterrence function, and perhaps won't actually get to the root of the problems within the companies involved. There are other range of problems that have to do with the effect on the victim states, and in particular the actual human victims of corruption. Do non-trial resolutions get to that, especially when they're negotiated across jurisdictions, as well as the potential lack of democratic authorization for non-trial resolution laws and practices. So these are not necessarily practices that have a basis or a clear legal basis in national law. That's not to say that prosecutors are acting illegally. It's just that they are using their administrative power rather than using legislation that has gone through the procedures of national debate in a, one would assume or hope, a democratically elected legislature. So I started by saying that we need to think more broadly about where these types of problems with settlements are problems. And that's because these array of challenges and others are actually drawn from academic studies of the experience in rule of law countries, particularly the US. There's been the most written on the use of deferred prosecution and plea agreements in the United States. So I think that what we could say is that you would anticipate that these types of problems are going to be amplified in a system where there are fewer checks and balances. And indeed, I'm working with colleagues right now who are studying the Brazilian car wash investigation, and their research, albeit preliminary in the context of our cooperation, does illustrate some of those challenges. That said, I think really what we need to be talking about and thinking about is how cooperation, if that's the focus of our discussion, can mitigate those challenges or not. And if so, what form of cooperation those mitigation measures can take. Should it be in the form of the OECD recommendations? Are they the best way of trying to regulate these problems? Or is it country to country practice? So learning from one prosecutor to another or one legislature to another. Is it important that countries who are taking the lead on this type of action are, as it were, setting a good example? So I think we need to have a conversation about the various ways that we can seek to improve the use of non-trial resolution across the board. The fact is it's done a lot, even if it's not necessarily optimal. I don't take a view on that. And we need to have a discussion about the kind of smart mix of regulatory interventions that international and domestic actors can play.
Thank you, Radha. On the second question, how the institutions which are here at the table today can tackle the demand side, and maybe also piggybacking on that, the question of referrals, which is one of the way indeed in which you are referring to the country, and the country is supposed to do its job. Who would like to jump in? If not, I will designate a volunteer myself. Gianpiero, you start. And then
I was about to volunteer myself anyway. Yes, the World Bank does not have the capacity to sanction public officials. So this is one thing that I didn't mention before, but I'm happy to mention it now. So we can sanction individuals and companies, contractors, but we cannot sanction public officials, civil servants in the member countries where we are working. However, through the referrals, we can refer those information to those member countries to ask them to take actions on those facts and to possibly initiate investigations and end up in sanctions on those public officials. Referrals for us are a first way to start that communication, that cooperation with the national authorities. And if the national authorities are reactive to our referrals, then we are more than happy to engage more in the kind of cooperation to the extent that we can, and to the extent that our privileges and immunities are protected, because that's probably the most important thing for us when it comes to international cooperation with law enforcement. There have been success stories about the demand side, I would say, particularly with a case which is not the one that you mentioned, but it's another one where We had a pretty extensive investigation in the health sector, and we cooperate actually with a number of law enforcement agencies, some of which are represented today actually in this room. And we referred with a number of referrals to several jurisdictions, and actions were taken on the demand side as well, including a former World Bank staff member who nowadays is in jail in the UK. So, I mean, we do that. We do refer information. We are, like I said, we are happy to share more if the countries are interested in pursuing our referral. I guess the problem goes back to what we were earlier discussing, you know, the capacity or the will, the political will to go after this information to prosecute these cases. This is probably, you know, we go back to square one now, where we have to build that capacity in the member countries and build, make sure that, you know, they have the political will to go after the public official and the demand side. So I will stop there and.
Would I be able to jump in on that? I was just going to say a few points. So firstly, our role as a prosecuting agency means that we really never lose sight of the fact that the individuals are the ones who actually commit the misconduct. And we continue to investigate and prosecute individuals where appropriate. Those investigations are side by side the ones that are into the corporate entities. And we will prosecute where the evidence and the public interest justifies it, as we do with corporates. A significant part of a DPA in our jurisdiction, it requires really proactive cooperation with us from a really early stage, and that will often involve assisting with providing information on employees, for example, who may have been involved in the misconduct. So again, we would think in the right circumstances, a DPA with a company could very well also lead to prosecuting individuals who actually were responsible for any misconduct. And just to point on dealing with investigations that, you know, if it's a company with a UK subsidiary or UK nexus, but the corruption itself occurred in a jurisdiction that had human rights considerations that we had to apply, if their legal system is not one that we consider to be a safe and sound legal system, you know, our Foreign and Commonwealth Office will often be involved in those discussions. And so we do have to be careful when we are engaging internationally, and individuals who are investigating maybe aren't resident in our jurisdiction, but are resident elsewhere. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I would like also to note to the question that actually there is an Article 16, paragraph 2 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which in theory gives the possibility, and there was a mention this afternoon to the universal jurisdiction, to possibly enact a legislation which allows investigation and prosecution of the foreign public officials. I speak under the control of my UNODC colleagues. I don't believe that, or maybe one country has adopted a legislation which encompasses this possibility. I don't think there has been a lot of enthusiasm, let's put it this way, on implementation of Article 16, paragraph 2, which is not an obligation, it's a possibility for countries. It's 6:30, but I still would like, if I may, Alexandra, give an opportunity to here in Vienna to ask at least a couple of questions, if there are questions. Yes.
Hello, Koshamin, Transparency International. This is a question for Dr. Radha and any of the law enforcement colleagues. One of the comments made in the previous session by Judge Wolf was that enforcement is an effective prevention mechanism by dissuading corrupt actors. Is there a danger that the primary pursuit of non-trial settlements for their cost efficiency, the difficulties in securing convictions, will turn foreign bribery cases for corporates into an exercise of risk assessment, given the financial benefits to them of grand corruption, and especially given the clear lack or failure of enforcement of foreign bribery globally?
Who wants to pick up?
Nicola, this is Judge Wolf. if I could respond to that briefly and pick up on something you said, the last comment.
Please join the panel, Mark.
Well, I wish I was there. Alexandra was very kind to encourage me to do this. The last comment I really subscribe to, and I think we will be discussing it with one of my co-panelists tomorrow morning, is a suggestion to arbitrate bribery cases, because it will just become a cost of doing business. And I think that's last comment was a wise one. But I wanted to pick up, because I was going to make the point, and unsurprisingly you did, of the lack of anything to address the demand side. The public officials, the highest level public officials who demand bribes. The World Bank doesn't have the capacity to do that. And if it needs to refer a case to a country controlled by a kleptocrat, it may, with corrupt courts and administration of justice, there'll be no remedy. And this is, I think, going to be a particularly serious problem with regard to the Green Climate Fund and private investment that's urgently needed for to address ameliorate climate change. It's discussed briefly in my paper on the International Anti-Corruption Court for tomorrow, but if I understand what was explained today, which is consistent with what I've understood, while the Green Climate Fund really doesn't have an investigative or prosecutorial capacity. First, like the World Bank, only private corporations, for example, could be sanctioned if they pay a bribe to get a contract under the Green Climate Fund, but not the party that extorted the payment. And if they find evidence of corruption, they have to turn it over to the national authorities. But by our calculations, at least 42% of that $100 billion is supposed to go to countries that are rated the most, among the most corrupt by Transparency International. There's a very good chance that, just as with the COVID money that was distributed, a high percentage of it is going to be misappropriated or misapplied by kleptocrats, and they can't be prosecuted in their own countries because they control the administration of justice. So, as you know, Nicola, we've discussed that the International Anti-Corruption Court is intended to address the demand side the way the World Bank, the Green Climate Fund, and indeed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in its OECD bribery counterparts can't do. So the demand side, I think, is very important. In criminalization, treating these.
Mark, I will have to exercise my prerogative.
I'm going to stop. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Before, Albert is entitled to have a fair trial, so he should be able to respond to the points that you made. But before giving the floor to Albert and Adam, I recognize Adam, and then we will close with Albert and maybe the answer to Adam questions.
Adam Furdash from Transparency International, and also a question to Albert. And you compared the Green Climate Fund to multilateral development banks, and I agree with this comparison. What I wanted to ask, is there any reason why the Green Climate Fund has not joined the cross-department system so far? And what are the chances for the future that it can or somehow it will join?
So you are on the spot now, my friend.
Maybe if I can take this backwards order here real quick. The Green Climate Fund would like to be able to be part of the cross-development regime. However, that is really kind of something that is outside of our control. It is part of our mandate to try and work towards the development. And I'm hoping that maybe we can have a conversation, start a discussion with MDB colleagues and see if we can be part of that sanctions regime. Because indeed, I mean, we've spoken about it here just a little bit ago in terms of deterrent. This would be a huge deterrent. And it speaks to the question about what can we do to address corruption on the demand side. we do administrative investigations. That is the truth, that we cannot prosecute, we cannot criminalize. But what we can do is at any point during the investigation life cycle, we can refer that to national authorities. Our prohibited practices policy is very specific in terms of corrupt practices, in that we can take action, administrative albeit, but we can also refer that for criminal prosecution. Over.
So, if any of the panelists would like to say a word of conclusion, I've been much less effective than my predecessor because I will not be able to wrap up the conversation at all, except maybe to notice, to make one observation, which is, I think there is a sort of commonality between the discussion on the non-trial resolution and the discussion about the mechanism that will be seen of international investigative cooperation that we've been discussing. And it would be a new panel, and we don't have the time and an opportunity. I think they both come from a recognition that the traditional means in the judiciary context, which is a trial, going to court, have not delivered, and the traditional means of cooperation, MLA and others, have also not delivered. And I think it has, the common feature is that criminal law, at the end of the day, if you go back to the basic, was not intended to cover corporations. Criminal law was intended to cover individuals and was intended to cover individuals acting in the domestic arena. And I think the concept of criminal law for corporations in an international context as this reaches its limits because, as I said, the structure is not there. And I think what we have been hearing in the last 1.5 hours are ways to mitigate the constraint of this original. I don't want to call it an original sin but this original feature. But they have the limits of any mitigation system, which is, you're not really addressing this from a more systemic point of view. So with that, I will leave it to Mark tomorrow to address this with a more systemic and radical proposal, which is establishment of an international anti-corruption court. With that, I'm really sorry to have you kept until 20 to 7. But I would like to thank again UNODC. I can also thank UNODC. Well, I thank UNODC, OECD, World Bank, and the American Society of International Law for this, and all the panelists for this very interesting panel. As you can see, we could have stayed here for another couple of hours. Thank you.